Hi everyone, it's Jerry. This is round 3 from the 2013 Zurich Chess Challenge between Hikaru Nakamura, who's playing the white side, versus the current world champion Magnus Carlsen. We have Nakamura opening with d4, and keep in mind, prior to this game, Nakamura has yet to defeat Carlsen in classical time controls. I believe the score stands at 7 losses and 15 draws. So still in search of his first win. Carlsen playing knight f6, c4, e6, knight c3. We go into a Nimzo-Indian Defense. f3 is played. We saw this in game 9 of the 2013 World Chess Championship match where Anand had the white pieces versus Carlsen. And in that game we saw after d5, a3. Things are different, however, in this particular game. In round 9 of the World Championship match, we had bishop takes knight. That's what Carlsen played, and we went down this particular road. We entered this particular pawn structure, preventing the bishop from getting on this diagonal with c4. But things are different here. After a3, the bishop instead returns to e7 instead of taking the knight, which allows white to now build a strong center with e4, takes, and now something clearly needs to be done about this pawn mass. This group of 3 white pawns in the center. e5 is it, striking at the heart of this structure. Now, keep in mind, pawn takes is not a good idea. This pawn will be won back after knight g4, threatening e5 and f2, so that's not really a road to go down. Instead, it's d5, grabbing some space. This, however, leaves a gap on c5, something the bishop makes use of right away. And it eyes now the weakest square in the white position, namely d4. This is a hole in the white position and already has good support by a black pawn. So following up, bishop g5, black castles, knight f3, getting the minor pieces out. This tension is clarified right away, investing the bishop, but trying to work on the dark squares, essentially. That knight was a strong defender of that weak point, d4. So that is eliminated. White has the bishop pair, but could that be really put to use? In particular, can this bishop on f1 really be put to use? He's the one who's really obstructed the most when we take a look at the pawns on the white side here. The pawns are essentially fixed on these light squares, and so he doesn't have too many options. So knight d7. This is a way that black will eventually get out of this pin. The queen is now free to move since the knight would then be there to defend or recapture on f6. And now with this queenside castle, we essentially have the battle lines drawn. Opposite sides castling, the biggest factor will be time, and we really need to come at one another's king and try to open lines so as to attack one another's king. And we have the start of that with first bishop d4 by Carlsen, eyeing some squares on this king position and looking to cement that bishop with c5. And we see that very shortly. First, this is challenged. Knight e2 looks to get rid of that annoying piece on d4, but not so fast. c5 is there, so then if takes, well, now this is a very strong passed pawn, and now there's a half-open c-file for black to work with. Certainly that bishop will not be captured right now, but it could be captured a little bit later, and by a little bit I mean just 2 moves later. There is an opportunity for white at this point, after c5. There is an opportunity for white to take on c6 like this, and after the recapture, now take. And at the end of it, white is up a pawn, but black certainly will have compensation for that pawn, namely compensation in the form of dark squares and an open line towards this white king. This is a very natural and strong move, observing the dark squares, putting pressure on the rook, b2, and notice now these 2 squares that are launching pads for a launching pad essentially for this knight. So there's certainly a lot of activity that black would have. There is certainly compensation for being down a pawn. This is something white shies away from. Nakamura does not bite on this particular variation, instead allows the bishop to be cemented by these 2 pawns on d4, and instead turns his attention towards the king side with g4, and this will serve well to reinforce a knight on f5, as well as maybe even push with g5, which will control that f6 square. and kick the knight around. So we have black taking action on the other side of the board with a5. This is the main idea with this is, well, eventually it clamps down with a4, clamps down in this structure, but provides a rook lift. Rook to a6, some lateral defense. I believe actually it was in that game 9 of the World Championship match where Carlsen also made this particular pawn advance, and we did have this type of a rook lift. So we have that same feature in this particular game. A rook on a6 will be multifunctioning, potentially guarding some kingside dark squares as well as pivoting on b6, where it could function well, coordinate well with the bishop that's on d4, the b2 point in particular. So we have king b1. This is vacating c1 so that the bishop is there to defend b2 one day. Rook a6, knight g3, and now keeping the knight out of these f5 squares. It's certainly a weakening move, but this is the little give and take, right? It weakens the dark squares, but it keeps the knight out of a very aggressive post on f5, and it also is giving white something to bite at, because when h5 is played, well, this h-file will open up. So Carlsen is essentially weighing that it's better to keep this knight out. That's the most direct move. Really don't want to allow a knight into that square, so that's prevented. And let's see who gets there first. We have h4, a4, rook h2 is a nice move. This is there to defend b2 as well as vacate h1 so that we could eventually double rooks on the h-file and attack that black king, essentially looking for checkmate here. So queen a5, the bishop returns to give the queen a kick off of this diagonal, and it's clearing the way for a g5 push. White is very fast. Now comes g5, the knight has to go back, h5, and white is certainly the side who is quicker. And the h-file will be opened up very soon, and now after rook to b6, something needs to be done about b2. We had a bishop c1 there to defend. The bishop, the king, and the rook are all there to cover this b2 square. This was an opportunity, an important point in the game right here, because there was an opportunity for white to go ahead and win some material. The move bishop to a5 could have been played, placing black in a skewer. And after rook takes, queen takes, well, black is up some material, but this rook is hit, and now there's maybe the opportunity for black to be a little bit faster. Black has invested some material, but diverted the white pieces away from attacking the black king. This may seem appealing to grab on b7 as a follow-up, not only because it wins a pawn, but now it's attacking the knight, but surprisingly enough, you could ignore the threat on the knight by playing knight d6, and I believe black is able to get away from any danger to the king by having some type of perpetual check. I believe it would be something, maybe even like king c2 check, king here, and then after rook to b3, rook d3, we would have this sort of thing going on. I believe the queen checks, we have this sort of stuff. At the end of it, we end up having a perpetual check. This is the best that white would be able to do. So in short, you really don't want to go down this particular line. There's a much cleaner approach to not allowing, there's a much cleaner approach in the sense that you don't have to allow your king to be attacked like this, or allow black an opportunity for some perpetual check. Instead, it's not investing some material, not going down this line, but instead simply defending b2. And eventually the bishop will get out of the way. This idea, again, getting on the h-file, blasting open, capturing on g6, and looking for mate. So rook to b3 hits the queen, and now queen g4, and this is the first real moment where Carlsen had to think and started to really worry. The queen is ready to come over, and again, some type of capture and looking for mate on h7. So comes knight b6, attacking c4, and clearing the way for this queen to be defending h7 after this type of a capture. So bishop e2, this is a clearance, looking for that h1 square for the rook. Knight d6, And all very natural. These rooks are ready to crash through on the H file. The computer at this point was citing lines associated with taking on G6 right away, but really who could argue with an immediate doubling on the H file? It's very natural and it's good. So rook on D to H1, and now out of desperation, Carlsen is trying some capture on B2, trying to disrupt the white pieces along this H file. Bishop takes B2, knight takes C4, trying to exploit this pin on the bishop, trying to get that piece back. We have takes, the rook is now there to defend the bishop. Knight takes, and after H takes G, we have queen to B6, and this piece has a lot of pressure on it, but there are multiple ways that white could be winning from this position. The one that's chosen is G7. I believe you can also capture in this position, but the one that's chosen is G7. This is winning as well, hitting the rook. And after rook to D8, we had queen to H4. Keep in mind, there's not going to be any mate. It seems like something needs to be done about this B2 point, but after queen H4, well, we do in fact have rook takes bishop, but you don't capture. This will just turn out to be a mate. So you play king to A1. That's the idea, and there's no good follow-up. There's no good follow-up check against this white king. So after the piece is regained, it's simply king scooting over to the corner, king to A1, and now basically having to get rid of the pressure against H7, capturing first on H2, rook takes, and now the queen swings over to defend H7. In comes the knight, however, threatening a deadly fork on E7. That will simply be lights out, so Carlsen just sneaks over there, is defending against E7, and queen G4, queen B6, looking to maybe enter on these squares if given a moment to breathe, since a little pressure has been placed, or has been released, I should say, after queen G4. There's not as much pressure against H7, and what's being threatened right now is rook H6, which would be trapping that queen. She really wouldn't have any safe squares. So that's one of the ideas, at least, behind queen to G4, this rook H6 move. So we had a sort of a little back and forth here. Queen came over to B6 to get out of that idea. Queen came back to H3. The queen has to come back over to defend against that mate threat, H7. And now we had actually a very big slip by Nakamura with D6. It's a very common move, or a very, very natural move, I should say, to want to play, because it's providing support for knight to E7 with that fork. And after knight takes, white, it seems as though has won that minor piece. White did in fact win that minor piece, and black can't take that knight back. That's the idea, because we would end up having mate. But now this is allowing black an opportunity to become activated with rook to D8. So the tables really do turn at this point, a little bit prior to meeting that 40th move, meeting that first time control. Instead of D6, really the winning shot here would be queen to F1. That would be a nice one, where she hits the knight and also sets up a nice tactical shot. An interesting move, well, let's say a natural move, would be to play B5, defending the knight, but now could come rook takes H7, where if king takes rook, we're going to end up having checkmate soon enough. And the other line would be, well, what would happen if you take with the queen? Well, now comes knight to H6, check, and if you take the pawn with the king, then we're going to end up having mate in the following way, and white's of course winning that. So the other line is going to be after knight H6, well, basically you have to give up the queen, and this is going to be completely winning for white. One line might be knight D6, queen here, threatening the knight, knight takes, you give a check, you're threatening this, a rook here, and you pick up the knight, and you're going to end up winning from this position. But this is not a road that we went down. There was a big slip here, one that simply threw away the advantage Instead of queen to f1, we had d6, knight takes, rook d8, and now all of a sudden we have an open line towards this white king. And knight to c4 is really throwing the game away. We go from maybe having an opportunity to still hold a draw to, well, white is really now all of a sudden the side who's on their heels. Knight c4 was played, which allows now queen takes e4, and these pieces are now very active, and there's a ton of calculation all of a sudden that white is having to do with this exposed king. Black is needing to only watch over this one square h7, whereas white is having to watch over queen e1, rook to d1, all sorts of different checks against their own king. So an unfortunate, a very unfortunate slip here. Still looking for his first win, playing now knight to c4, and the advantage is clearly now tipping, and it's very difficult. We've met now the 40th move, the first time control, rook d3, and well, maybe the last hope at this point after queen takes e was to play knight to e3, and something of this nature where the knight is able to get to f5, and maybe the best that black could do is some type of a perpetual check, since the knight is defending here and blocking the queen from now defending h7. This is maybe the best chance, but this move, keep in mind, knight e3, well, this right here was going to be the 40th move for white, and still didn't have he didn't have too much time remaining on his clock at this point. So it was queen to h5 that was played, not knight to e3, which may very well have held this game to a draw, but things are turning and not in white's favor at this point. So white tries to fight on, but it's just too much. There's now a significant material imbalance, essentially five pawns versus a knight, and Carlsen doesn't let this one slip, staying very coordinated. There's some checks that are thrown in, and this pawn simply continues to march, and this one will march, and there's not going to be much that you can do to stop it. So this is essentially how it finishes up. The white king tries to just get out of the way of any queen checks by coming over here, trying to hide behind that pawn, but these pawns are just, of course, way too advanced, and they will soon be queening after this one check right here, queen to a7. After the king moves, we'll just have another queen being placed on the board, and it is actually at this point, after this check, that Nakamura ends up resigning. So a very big turn of events, very difficult loss, I imagine. I've had my own experience of trying to, or having a game where I was winning, and then it turns out to, let's say, be a draw, and that's a difficult one to stomach. So I could only imagine that type of turn of events, going from a really winning position to having to stomach now a loss. So nevertheless, it was a very interesting game, and I hope you enjoyed it. So take care. Bye.